What if a mining crew blasted into solid rock and discovered a metal object that seemed to belong to a technological age that had not yet arrived? That is the mystery surrounding an unusual artifact reportedly recovered in 1889 from the copper workings above Silver Bow Creek, near Butte, Montana. It was not found lying on the floor of an abandoned tunnel. It was not buried in loose soil. According to the surviving account, it was trapped inside solid rock. And when the object was examined, the strangest feature was not simply its age. It was the precision of its construction. The artifact was made from a copper-based alloy and measured roughly 9 inches long. One end narrowed into something resembling a wedge or chisel. Along its flattened body were a series of remarkably regular grooves arranged in a spiral. The consulting geologist who examined it reportedly compared those grooves to the thread of a machine screw. But this was Montana in 1889. So how could such an object have existed there? And perhaps even more strangely, why did the written record surrounding the discovery almost immediately become so difficult to follow? To understand the mystery, we have to go back to the night it was discovered. On February 11, 1889, shift boss Thomas Bracken descended into the blue vein workings above Silver Bow Creek. Bracken was not an inexperienced miner. He had spent 11 years working copper ground and understood exactly what a freshly blasted section of rock should look like. The previous night's blasting operation had gone badly. A powder crew had apparently overloaded a hole on the 800-foot level, leaving the rock face fractured but not completely broken apart. Bracken went underground to inspect the damage. Instead of another ordinary vein of copper-bearing rock, he noticed something embedded in the fractured stone. It was dark green from corrosion, but beneath that weathered surface was something that immediately appeared artificial. Bracken did not simply pull it free. He sent for the mine superintendent, Walter DeSlaw. The two men remained underground for hours, carefully working around the surrounding rock rather than using another explosive charge. By nearly 4 in the morning, they had recovered the object intact. It was approximately 9 inches long. Its shape was unusual. One end tapered into something similar to a wedge or chisel, while the rest of the piece was flattened. But the grooves were what made it extraordinary. They were evenly spaced and followed a spiral pattern along the metal. The artifact was then taken out of the mine and placed on the superintendent's office shelf while arrangements were made for a geological examination. That should have been the beginning of an investigation. Instead, it became the beginning of a paper trail that would soon grow strangely thin. The company's consulting geologist was Ansel Pruitt. Pruitt had trained in the eastern United States before coming west to work in Montana's copper country. He approached the artifact as a technical problem. He weighed it, he drew it, he examined its surface, and according to the transcript's account of his report, he identified the metal as a copper alloy containing tin and a smaller quantity of another metal that he could not identify with the chemical reagents available to him. Pruitt reportedly described it as a bronze unlike the examples available in the mining literature of his time. But the metal composition was only part of the mystery. The grooves presented a much more difficult problem. They were not random scratches. They appeared to follow a consistent spiral. Pruitt reportedly counted 11 turns before the taper made further measurement impossible. He measured the pitch at slightly less than 1/10 of an inch per turn. That level of consistency caught his attention. The account says Pruitt later compared the pattern to machine screw threading in a private letter to a colleague in Helena. That comparison is important because the issue was not whether a lathe existed in 1889. It did. The issue was whether such machinery and techniques were available in this particular mining environment and whether they were being used to manufacture copper alloy tools of this kind. The mine's blacksmith reportedly tried to reproduce the grooves. He could not. Traditional hand filing tended to leave small irregularities where a tool slipped, dug too deeply, or changed direction. The grooves on the artifact appeared much more uniform. The surface beneath the corrosion was also described as unusually smooth. That left the investigators with an uncomfortable question. If the object had been made by hand, how had its maker achieved such consistency? And if it had been machined, where had the necessary equipment and process come from? The artifact itself was strange. But the surrounding rock was arguably even more important. The object was reportedly not discovered in a cavity or a loose deposit. The surveyor examining the area found no obvious fracture or opening through which the artifact could have entered after the surrounding rock had formed. In other words, according to the account, it appeared to have been enclosed within the rock itself. That changes the question completely. If someone had simply dropped a strange metal object inside an old mine tunnel, there would be countless ordinary explanations. Could have belonged to a miner. Could have been discarded equipment. Could have been misplaced. But an object enclosed within apparently undisturbed rock raises a different problem. The question becomes, how did it get there in the first place? The transcript does not provide a definitive answer. And that distinction matters. The evidence described in the record does not establish who made the artifact, when it was manufactured, or how it became enclosed in the geological formation. It establishes only that the object was reportedly recovered from that location and subsequently examined. The mystery begins precisely where the explanation ends. After Pruitt's examination, the story takes another unexpected turn. The company had extensive records. Mining operations depended on paperwork. Powder use was documented. Ore production was documented. Wages were documented. Daily operations were recorded in shift books. And yet the pages surrounding the discovery reportedly contain an unusual gap. The entry documenting the discovery is attributed to Bracken. Then, according to the transcript, 3 subsequent entries were missing. The pages were reportedly cut away rather than simply torn. The next surviving entry was written in another hand and made no reference to the artifact. That does not tell us what happened. It does not prove that anyone deliberately suppressed the discovery. But it does create an obvious historical question. Why does the documentation become less complete precisely after the artifact appears? The transcript presents no surviving explanation. And that missing information has become part of the mystery itself. Pruitt's career provides another curious detail. Before the blue vein discovery, he had published work concerning Montana copper mineralogy. Afterward, his documented publications reportedly shifted away from Montana copper. He later worked on irrigation drainage in the Gallatin Valley and eventually accepted a position elsewhere. The transcript also describes a private letter in which Pruitt discussed the unusual grooves and compared them to machine screw threading. After that, however, there is no reported follow-up study of the artifact from him. Again, there are several possible explanations. Perhaps Pruitt simply considered the matter unresolved. Perhaps there was no opportunity for further research. Perhaps the artifact was not considered important enough to pursue. Or perhaps the discovery created questions that nobody involved wanted to investigate further. The surviving account does not tell us which explanation is correct. What we do know is that the investigation did not develop into the extensive scientific study one might expect from such an unusual find. There is another strange detail. The artifact apparently did not remain in a company vault. Before it could reportedly be sent east for additional examination, the superintendent gave it to Thomas Bracken. It was described as a keepsake for his work during the difficult recovery. There was apparently no formal transfer record, no official receipt. Instead, the surviving account points to a personal letter written by the superintendent to his brother. Bracken kept the object. His family kept it after him. Eventually, according to the transcript, it passed through several Montana households before being acquired by a museum in Bozeman during the 1960s. Today, it is reportedly cataloged simply as an unidentified copper alloy artifact of disputed origin. And that may be the most frustrating description of all, because it does not solve the mystery. It merely gives the object a place to sit. The story becomes even more interesting when we look at other examples involving ancient mining and unusual metal objects. One of the most important comparisons comes from the copper country around Lake Superior. On Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale, 19th-century prospectors encountered enormous numbers of ancient mining pits. Some were excavated deeply into solid rock. Many had been filled over time by soil and forest debris. Inside them, investigators found stone hammers, wooden tools preserved in waterlogged conditions, and pieces of native copper that had already been separated from their surrounding rock. The quantities involved were significant. 19th-century geologists estimated that ancient miners had extracted enormous amounts of copper from the region. The exact chronology and scale remain subjects of historical and archaeological interpretation, but the existence of extensive prehistoric copper workings in the Lake Superior region is a separate and well-known part of the area's history. What makes these sites relevant to the Blue Vein story is the question of abandonment. Some ancient workings contain tools and partially completed work. The evidence suggested that copper extraction had continued over a very long period before eventually stopping. The reasons for that transition are not explained by the Blue Vein record. But the comparison introduces an important possibility. Mining landscapes can preserve evidence of people and technologies long after the people themselves have disappeared. A second case is considerably more controversial. In 1974, workers at a sand quarry near the Mureș River in Romania reportedly uncovered an unusual aluminum alloy object in association with mastodon remains. The geological context was interpreted as extremely old. That immediately created a chronological problem because industrial aluminum production belongs to a much more recent technological period. But unlike the Blue Vein artifact, the Ayad object has generated significant disagreement over its interpretation. Some examinations have been presented as evidence that the material could be genuinely old. Other interpretations have suggested that the object could instead be relatively modern industrial material that somehow became incorporated into older sediment. The precise circumstances remain disputed, and that uncertainty is important. The Ayad object cannot responsibly be presented as definitive proof of an ancient aluminum technology. It is better understood as a disputed archaeological anomaly whose interpretation remains contested. That distinction also helps us understand the Blue Vein artifact. Unusual does not automatically mean impossible, and unexplained does not automatically mean evidence of a lost civilization. So what connects a strange copper alloy artifact in Montana, prehistoric copper workings around Lake Superior, and the disputed Ayad object? Not a proven common origin, not a demonstrated lost civilization, and not evidence of a forgotten industrial revolution. What they share is something much simpler. Each involves physical evidence that creates questions about the assumed historical timeline. And once those questions appear, the quality of the documentation becomes critical. In the Blue Vein case, the object was reportedly examined by a professional geologist. The artifact was documented. Measurements were taken. The material was described. The grooves were studied. But the investigation did not continue indefinitely. The artifact eventually became a family keepsake and later a museum specimen. The story survived. The investigation did not. Of all the characteristics attributed to the Blue Vein artifact, one remains particularly difficult to ignore: the spiral grooves. If the grooves really were as regular as described, then someone or something produced them with a degree of consistency that 19th-century investigators found difficult to reproduce manually. That does not automatically tell us when the artifact was made. It does not identify its maker, and it does not prove that the object predates known mining activity. But it does create a technical question. What manufacturing process produced the pattern? The transcript says the mine's blacksmith attempted to reproduce it and failed. It also describes a maintenance ledger note in which the piece was characterized as looking machined, followed by the observation that no machine in the territory could have produced it. That statement captures the entire problem. The object appeared to possess characteristics associated with machining. Yet the available local technology did not seem to provide an obvious explanation for how such an artifact could have been manufactured in that environment. Those are two separate facts. The first concerns the object's physical appearance. The second concerns the technological context. The mystery exists in the gap between them. This is where the story needs restraint. It would be tempting to jump from an unexplained object to an extraordinary conclusion. A forgotten civilization, a technologically advanced society, a visitor from somewhere else, an unknown chapter of human history. But none of those explanations is established by the evidence described in the transcript. The record does not identify the manufacturer. It does not provide a secure date for the object's manufacture. It does not explain how the object entered the rock. And it does not provide enough information to reconstruct the complete chain of events. What it does provide is a strange historical case. A named miner, a specific date, a particular mining level, a metal object, a geological examination, measurements of unusual grooves, a missing portion of the surrounding paperwork, and an artifact that reportedly survived long enough to reach a museum. That is already enough to ask questions. We do not need to manufacture answers. Thomas Bracken continued working in Montana's copper mines for years after the discovery. According to the surviving family recollections described in the transcript, he continued to tell the story as a straightforward event rather than turning it into a legend. The mine eventually closed. The workings were sealed. The blue vein became part of the region's mining history, but the artifact survived. Today, according to the account, it remains in a museum collection in Bozeman. The original mine records also survived in an archive. And somewhere within those records are the missing pages that surround the discovery. That leaves us with an unusual situation. The physical object reportedly survived. The written record partially survived. The people who first examined it are long gone. And the technology capable of resolving the question has advanced enormously since 1889. Modern metallurgical analysis could potentially tell us much more about the alloy than Pruitt's 19th century chemical tests could. Modern imaging could reveal details beneath corrosion. Modern microscopy could examine the grooves at a level impossible in a Montana mining camp in the 19th century. But the central historical question would remain. How did the object get inside the rock? And who made it? Those questions are separate from whether the artifact is genuinely ancient, historically misinterpreted, or simply an unusual object whose original circumstances have been lost. Perhaps the most fascinating part of the blue vein story is not the idea that it proves something extraordinary. It doesn't. The fascinating part is that the evidence, as presented, seems to stop just before the explanation. The object was discovered. It was examined. Measurements were recorded. Its unusual construction was noticed. Then the investigation faded. The artifact changed hands. The mine eventually disappeared from active use. And the mystery remained. That is why this case continues to invite attention. Not because we know what the object was, but because we don't. A 9-inch piece of copper alloy reportedly came out of a Montana rock face in 1889. Its surface carried a spiral pattern that observers considered remarkably precise. Its geological context created questions about how it had arrived there. This documentation contains unexplained gaps. Its examining geologist apparently never produced a full follow-up study. And the object ultimately survived as an unidentified artifact rather than a solved archaeological discovery. More than a century later, the same basic question remains. Was the blue vein artifact simply an unusual object whose history was lost? Was its geological context misunderstood? Was its manufacturing process more ordinary than the surviving account suggests? Or is there some part of the story that 19th century investigators simply did not have the tools to understand? The evidence described here does not give us the answer. It gives us something more frustrating. A physical object. A strange set of measurements. A fragmentary record. And a question that has remained open for generations. Because sometimes history does not leave behind a complete explanation. Sometimes it leaves behind 9 inches of corroded metal, 11 mysterious turns in its surface, and just enough evidence to make us wonder what happened before anyone was there to record it. And that may be the real mystery of the blue vein artifact. Not that it proves something impossible, but that, after more than a century, nobody has definitively explained what it was or how it got there.